Knossos is the oldest continuously inhabited prehistoric site in the Aegean, and this fact, combined with more than a century of investigation, means that it offers an unrivaled set of data with which to explore prehistoric social evolution. In the case of the Neolithic period, Knossos is especially important because for most of its phases, it represents the only open-air habitation site currently known, or else is the only one to have been systematically investigated. Doing full justice to 5,000 years of data in half an hour is obviously a bit of an impossible task. But what I will do is present an overview of social life and social transformation at Knossos from its earliest permanent settlement around 7000 BC as Europe's earliest known farming village to the late 3rd millennium BC when it became one of Europe's earliest cities. It will be a story necessarily of snapshots from a century or so of high-quality excavations of Neolithic and early Bronze Age contexts at Knossos. Publication of the Neolithic material is currently being prepared by a team of specialists coordinated by myself and Dr. Valasia Isakidu, from whom you will be hearing later. My own lecture will draw heavily on my ongoing work on the pottery, architecture and stratigraphy of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age periods. This work now takes place within the framework of the Knossos Kephala project, which comprises archival research, ceramic study, GIS mapping and interpolation, that's geographical information systems, geophysical survey, and on-site recording and mapping of features. Okay, so to begin the story, until very recently, the story of human societies on Crete began with the arrival of the first farmers at Knossos, sometime around 7000 BC. Prior to that, so it seemed, Crete was a pristine Pleistocene wilderness, whose mammalian populations variously included some quite cute-looking pygmy hippos, elephants and deer, and an altogether more alarming species of giant mouse. I searched in vain for a picture of the giant mouse on the internet, but I only found this, but this seemed quite appropriate. But no human beings. That was part of the picture, was an absence of human occupation. In the last 3 years, however, that picture has been utterly transformed by surface finds of distinctively early types of lithic artifact at several locations along the south coast of Crete. Least surprising is the recognition of lithic material that testifies to the presence of foraging groups during the period known as the Mesolithic, which immediately precedes the Neolithic at the beginning of the early Holocene. Their absence had always been a puzzle, as Mesolithic foragers are known to have been present on all other large Mediterranean islands, as well as plenty of very small ones, so their discovery makes a lot of sense. Much more surprising is the discovery of lithic artifact types that imply a still older Palaeolithic presence. The oldest of these are claimed to be of early Palaeolithic type, that is, they date to a period before 200,000 BP. However, this claim certainly requires further substantiation and clarification. More credible are the claims for a middle and late Paleolithic presence, as these rest on a stronger set of taxonomic, technological and chronological data. Although the picture is still coming together, the most likely model at the moment appears to be one of periodic visitation to Crete by early modern humans and perhaps other human cousins, stretching back many millennia into the Pleistocene. Now, to return to Knossos, last year, rather unexpectedly, Knossos got drawn into this emerging pre-Neolithic story with a recognition of a small group of lithic artifacts dispersed amongst many hundreds of boxes from the old excavations, which have been identified by all authorities consulted so far as being of Middle Paleolithic type. That is, they date to somewhere between 40,000 and around 200,000 BP. These are still in the process of being studied, and so I cannot comment further on the technology and type, but they appear to indicate that the hill at Knossos was first visited by humans in the very distant Pleistocene past, many tens of thousands of years before the arrival of the first farmers. What sort of place was Knossos back then? Well, millennia of subsequent building have produced a tell-like overburden of material that has significantly altered its original appearance, as we have seen on previous photos in previous lectures today. But a sense of the original topography that greeted these early visitors may be gained from a recently completed GIS reconstruction of the natural topography, which uses data from several hundred tests across the hill, marked here with dots. This reveals a hill comprising a relatively level summit between three distinctive peaks, with slopes that descend steeply to the south and east, and more gently to the north and west. The only Paleolithic artifact to be found in any reconstructible relationship to the natural surface came from here, indicated on the slide. And if this is meaningful, which is still a big if, early human activity may have focused on the southeast edge of the hilltop or on the natural terrace just below it, both of which overlook the junction of two watercourses in a small valley and an obvious place where animals might gather. The earliest Neolithic community favoured a broadly similar location for their settlement, arriving around 7000 BC. And this is limited to the southeastern corner of the hilltop and directly overlooks the most fertile and well-watered soils in the valley, and thus the focus of their agricultural cultivation. The origins of this farming community are by no means clear. Before the identification of a Mesolithic presence on Crete, Knossos seemed to present a clear-cut case of island colonization by migrant farmers, and was thus frequently cited in support of the idea that farming and the Neolithic way of life was carried to Greece and the rest of Europe by an advancing wave of migrant farmers, originating somewhere in Southwest Asia. Now, however, with the evidence for the presence of Mesolithic foragers on the island, and with hints of some possible links in the technology and raw materials of the lithic tools used by Mesolithic foragers and the first farmers at Knossos, we need also to entertain an alternative model, namely that farming dispersed to Crete via existing social networks between foragers and was adopted by groups who had already made Crete their home during the Mesolithic. From the beginning, the initial Neolithic community at Knossos is characterized by a total reliance on a mixed farming economy of domesticated plants and animals. Absent at this time was pottery, as is also the case at the earliest farming sites of this period in west and southwest Turkey. Our windows onto this initial pre-pottery Neolithic phase are frustratingly sparse and restricted at Knossos. In two small trenches, we have evidence for up to 4 sequential building horizons, comprising walls built of large mud bricks and stones. But these give little sense of how these walls connect to form structures and spaces. During 2009, the Geophysical Survey of the Hill, during the 2009 Geophysical Survey of the Hill, a shadowy image of what appears to be a large deep-lying structure came to light in the area of these trenches. The likelihood that this structure is of initial Neolithic date is made strong by its orientation, which parallels that of the known initial Neolithic walls and not later architecture, and is oriented closely with the natural topography. This likelihood is also supported by the fact that no overlying later Neolithic structures are known from this part of the hill, while those of the Bronze Age follow a very different orientation. If this image is meaningful, it suggests that the initial Neolithic community lived in a tight cluster of spaces, which organisationally would suggest a close-knit cohabiting community of perhaps 50 or so people. To the north of this area of habitation, a third trench in area AC revealed an open-air area which produced evidence for food preparation and consumption, a burial, and a curvilinear structure of timber posts, mud brick and plaster. The fact that seed impressions were found in the surface of the plaster fragments and that the building was closely associated with a large cache of charred grain suggest it functioned as a communal storage facility or granary. Together, these fragments provide support for the idea that the very earliest farming communities in the Aegean were organised primarily along communal lines. Looking backwards in time, this implies that the earliest farmers in Crete continued, at least initially, to organise and view themselves according to a very similar set of communal rights and obligations as their foraging ancestors. Looking forward in time through the Neolithic into the early Bronze Age, we can sketch out a long, drawn-out process of social evolution, whereby a truly egalitarian communal society, subjugated entirely to the interests of the many, was progressively transformed into one driven by the interests of certain groups living within it and characterized by more permanent social inequalities. Around the middle of the 7th millennium BC, some 500 years or so after the first settlement of the hill, the beginning of the early Neolithic phase, what we call the early Neolithic, is marked by the first appearance of fragments of ceramic containers. These appear in contexts that are otherwise essentially the same as those of initial Neolithic. Indeed, the only other notable change around this time is the movement of the area of habitation northwards, leaving the area of the initial Neolithic settlement in favour of the summit of the hill. Much has been written about the supposed significance of the adoption of pottery in the wider context of human evolution, some of which bestow on it a revolutionising potential and have claimed it ushered in new forms of cooking, storage and consumption that in turn brought about increased adaptive potential and greater social complexity. The Knossos data, however, offer a rare opportunity to explore what actually took place. What we see is pottery fairly slavishly taking on the appearance of an array of pre-existing containers in wood and basketry. On the one side, there are an array of smaller open tableware vessels which inform finish and handle topology, skeuomorph, or that is copy, a similar array of wooden vessels performing the same function. On the other, there are several large globular jar forms which inform finish and handle typology, copy, basketry. Moreover, the extreme scarcity and inferior durability of the ceramic versions of these containers make it clear that these wooden and basket vessels continued to answer to the bulk of everyday container requirements during the ceramic Neolithic, while pottery appears to have been reserved for special, perhaps ritualized usage. And so the adoption of pottery at Knossos does not usher in a container revolution in cooking or storage, but instead reveals a pre-existing world of non-ceramic containers. The arrival of pottery also affords us a valuable window on social interaction and the wider Neolithic community beyond Knossos. Remember at this time that Knossos is the only known site on the island. Stylistic and petrographic study of the early and middle Neolithic pottery from Knossos has revealed the presence of pottery produced at various other locations within and beyond Crete, providing indirect testimony to the existence of other, probably similar, but as yet unknown communities on the island. Integration of provenance and frequency data suggests that ceramic interaction was most intense in the near vicinity of Knossos, an area marked blue on the slide, a pattern which would conform to the type of small world network model commonly associated with exogamy. However, it is also apparent that periodically more distant connections were also being made, linking the small world around Knossos with other small worlds, not just within Crete, but also in other regions of the southern Aegean. Now, elsewhere I've argued that the reason people travelled to such lengths during the earlier Neolithic is because distance functioned as a form of symbolic capital that could be accumulated by making long journeys and to make or maintain long-distance friendships. This capital could be expended through the consumption of gift items such as ceramic vessels which symbolized these distant relationships and provided a cue for displays of prowess through the narrating of object biographies and tales of travel and acquisition. Thus, on important occasions when the Knossos community came together to declare its shared values, it would also have been possible for different subgroups within the community to negotiate status. During the latter half of the 6th millennium, that is, during the transition between the Middle and Late Neolithic, there is an array of evidence to suggest a major socio-economic transformation, amounting to a major step change in social evolution. In common with many other Aegean Neolithic sites, the community at Knossos grows significantly to become a large village of between 150 and 450 inhabitants. Houses become larger and internally more complex. They are set more obviously apart and sit on larger foundations. This architectural isolation of the household coincides with the appearance of ceramic house models, which reify the household as a separable socio-economic unit. At the same time, there are some major changes in the technology and production of pottery, which collectively suggest the involvement of a smaller, more specialized and probably household-based unit of production. Once households gained greater control over their productive output, they would have enjoyed new opportunities for status competition and new incentives for technological change. Changes in craft production at this time and the introduction of special value-added crops, such as flax and possibly the olive and the vine, may all be read as deliberate attempts to control and increase the quality, quantity and diversity of household output, which might then be deployed competitively in the negotiation of status at various scales and contexts. Here we seem to be seeing the emergence of the household as a more independent socio-economic unit, albeit one still obviously embedded within a larger community that continued to assert its primacy over the self-interest, its primacy over the self-interest of any particular household. As far as we can see, this balancing out of the tension between the communal and household interests seems to have continued at Knossos without any sign of major socio-economic change for around 2 millennia. That is, through the late Neolithic and deep into the period that we call the final Neolithic. However, late in the final Neolithic, there are again signs of another major shift, one which, though still situated in the Neolithic, marks the beginning of those trajectories of development that we normally associate with the Bronze Age. More generally in Crete, we see the emergence of new strategies for livelihood and new forms of community, as variously demonstrated by the colonization of agriculturally marginal upland regions by small dispersed communities of sites, and by the emergence of trading sites and a more general divergence between coastal and inland zones. The emergence of trading is particularly suggestive as it relied on an increased social demand for prestige goods, which would have only been possible if later Neolithic communal controls over household, self-interest and accumulation had been substantially loosened. The implication is that from the end of the final Neolithic, households were more able to accumulate, appropriate and compete in ways that brought them into direct conflict with each other and with domains of communality that had previously been sacrosanct. Now, returning to Knossos, at the end of the final Neolithic, that is, in particular, the phase defined as Final Neolithic 4, we see a major reorganization of the hilltop. This is most clearly glimpsed below the later central court of the palace, where it is apparent that there was a large-scale levelling of the hill, resulting in the removal of higher-lying levels and the deposition of debris behind a north-south terrace wall. There is no precedent at all for levelling and terracing at this sort of scale during the Neolithic. Rather, this represents the beginning of a distinctively Bronze Age pattern of levelling, terracing and construction activity on the hill. Recognition of this is particularly significant because it means we must abandon the consensus view, or the old consensus view, held since Arthur Evans, that the hill was only first levelled much later, at the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, immediately prior to the construction of the first palace. Now, in what little time there is remaining, I can only sketch out what appears to happen on the hilltop between the end of the Neolithic and the close of the early Bronze Age, that is between 3,300 and around 2,200 BC. For anyone wishing to delve deeper into the data behind this, or else to catch up on other new research on this period, maybe I could shamelessly direct you to a new book, just published, entitled Back to the Beginning, out now, as they say. On top of this levelled hilltop in Final Neolithic 4, 2 large houses were constructed. That's the image you see on the left. And in the rectangular space east of these, a formal open court was laid out. These houses and court represent the first establishment of an alignment that is also followed by the Bronze Age walls and courts of the palace. A similar arrangement of houses and court is followed in a subsequent phase of use, that's the image you see on the right, which overlapped with the beginning of the early Bronze Age, that is the phase we term Early Minoan I. Activity in this Final Neolithic 4 to Early Minoan I court appear to have been focused around fixed hearths and involved the consumption of meat and ceramic vessels. A close contemporary analogy for such activity is available from the later palatial site of Festos. There, beneath the central and west courts of the palace, Thick deposits of late FN pottery and large quantities of animal bone are found in association with fixed hearths and have been interpreted as the remains of large-scale gatherings of people involving the ritualized consumption and deposition of animals in ceramic vessels. Late in early Minoan I, there is evidence for a second major construction episode at Knossos on the hilltop. This comprised a large-scale levelling episode which extended over the area of the central court and also beneath the later west wing. It served to remove all but tiny pockets of earlier EM I material from the hilltop. For instance, the houses to the west of the court were demolished and all but erased. Over most of the area of the central court, a fill was deposited, marked grey on the slide, and that most probably served as the make-up for a third, much larger court. The area of the court was also extended to the east and south, as shown by the construction of east-west and north-south terrace walls backed with fills. The result was a much enlarged court, not much smaller than the present central court today. Now, immediately to the west of this court, beneath and within the present west wing of the palace, the remains of an earlier Bronze Age system of rubble walls have recently come to light. In its entirety, this system appears to represent a very large complex of aligned buildings and evidences multiple architectural phases. However, its most striking feature is that it shares the same alignment and indeed in many cases the same plan as the walls of the later palace. Moreover, its walls not only underlie and anticipate the main elements of the building we call the palace, but also in some cases are actually incorporated as structural elements within it. The task of identifying the various phases of this earlier building complex, and importantly finding the deposits to date them, is still ongoing. There is, however, just about enough to suggest the following pattern of development. Late in EM I, immediately to the west of the enlarged court, a very large rectangular building with a footprint of approximately 23 by 40 metres appears to have been constructed. The rubble walls of this building were laid in deep foundation trenches into which pure clay had been rammed to serve as foundations. Standing fragments of what were most probably the north and south facades of this building survive thanks to their incorporation in the later palace. Other elements of this system have come to light in various excavations. Here you see a section through the later throne room system, which shows the existence of this earlier system of walls, and most importantly, the position of a closed wall foundation deposit of EM IIB date. Currently, this represents the best dating evidence we have for the walls in this area of the site. This large late EM I central building is very close in its dimensions to the large late EM I court, and together the two may have served as inside and outside halves of a single ceremonial focus for the Knossos community at this time. This late EM I central building and court lacks any use deposits, and thus the form such ceremonies took is open to debate. However, a sense of what might have gone on is provided by an unusual group of late EM I pottery that was tipped in to fill a well a short distance to the north of the court. David Wilson and Peter Day have interpreted its contents with their heavy focus on jugs and pedestal bowls as the remains of a specific episode of ritualized communal drinking. During the course of EM2, there is evidence to suggest that this central building and court expanded into what might properly be termed a court complex, with the addition of a series of discrete, aligned peripheral buildings to the north and west. These buildings appear to be separated by pre-existing lines of access running east-west and north-south. The earliest of these peripheral buildings appears to be constructed late in EM2A and lies just to the north of the late EM1 central building. Slightly later, probably early in EM2B, a second north building was built on a lower terrace to the north. Here you see parts of its north facade which survive below the present north facade of the palace. An EM2B deposit from above a floor within this building is unusual in several respects, not least because it has produced the earliest securely dated clay ceiling from Knossos, together with fragments of several stamped and or incised pithoi, which are at least twice the normal size of pithoi from domestic contexts of this time. There is also evidence to suggest the existence of additional EM IIB peripheral buildings to the west and northwest of the late EM I central building. Moving quickly into EM III, and there is evidence for minor expansion to the northwest with the construction of a massive northwest facade wall. This impressive piece of architecture seems to have enclosed an area already occupied by a northwest peripheral building and the EM IIA northwest ramp, and ultimately connected eastwards with the EM IIB north facade. Also constructed in EM III is the enigmatic structure that Evans called the Keep. This comprised a large, deep subterranean space retained by massive walls in the same masonry style as the northwest facade, and backed with a deep Neolithic to EM III fill. This structure may have functioned, I would like to suggest that this structure may have functioned as a subterranean hall, analogous to those constructed a little later at the beginning of Middle Minoan I, and at later times around the hill, and was in use until Middle Minoan 1b, when it was filled in and the whole area remodelled. Now to conclude, and looking back on the 1300 years or so between the late FN and the close of EM III, we can make a number of new observations about Knossos in particular and social evolution in general. First, it would seem now that the building we call the first palace was not the first such structure on the hill. Rather, its origins seem now to go back another 1,000 years or so to the construction of the first central building, which I would like to suggest took place late in EM I, or around approximately between 2900 and 2800 BC. This initial central building and court were subsequently joined by the end of EM II, or around 2300 BC, by a series of aligned peripheral buildings to form a court complex similar in form to the first palace. Second, it would seem that the institution of a court on the hill and its use as a communal ceremonial focus goes back even further in time, to the end of the Neolithic. It was around this court that the court complex first developed, and it is the Middle Minoan I phase of this court complex that Evans termed the first palace. Regarding social evolution at Knossos, it would seem that late in Final Neolithic, we see signs of a transformation of later Neolithic village society, complementing evidence from elsewhere in Crete. The creation of the court as a specific communal ritual focus opened up the possibility to exploit hierarchies of space and access as a means of defining social identity and inequality, place and history being valuable and powerful resources for the construction of social difference. In this respect, the large size of the houses flanking this court, the limited space available on the hilltop for additional houses, and the presence of imported exotica such as this copper axe surely entitle us to suspect that permanent differences in status and access to resources had already begun to emerge within the Knossos community during the Final Neolithic IV and early Minoan I periods. Late in EM I, the demolition of these houses on the hill and their replacement by an enlarged court and a large central building seem to signal a second shift in strategy, hinting perhaps that the central building in some way functioned as a proxy for the households on the hill, which were now perhaps located on the edges of the hilltop and on its lower terraces, an EM IIA example of which would be the West Court House. During early Minoan II, the addition of a series of peripheral buildings seems to signal a third shift. In a recent paper, I have argued that these peripheral buildings functioned as foci for different corporate groups within the Knossos community. In this way, the development from court building to court complex articulates changes to social organization at Knossos that become manifest from EM II. I believe that these groups represent a new corporate scale of social identity, larger than a single household, but smaller than the community. And I would argue that the emergence of this scale of social identity, in addition to the household, which has been around for much longer, played a crucial role in facilitating the rapid expansion or urbanization of the settlement, which first begins around this time and gathers pace during the transition to the Middle Bronze Age. And so, looking back over 5 millennia, we can see the progressive isolation of the household as an independent social, economic and political unit, and its progressive appropriation of communal rights, controls and obligations, until by the end of the Neolithic, a society once subjugated to the interests of the many had been transformed into one driven by the interests of specific groups. During the course of the early Bronze Age, we see the emergence of a corporate scale of group identity, with each corporate group perhaps headed by a privileged group or household. At the same time, we see the beginning of the urbanisation of Knossos and its transformation from village to city. Now, finally, I would like to dedicate this talk to the memory of the late John Evans, a man of multiple careers, wartime code breaker at Bletchley Park, director of the Institute of Archaeology here in London, and, of course, pioneering excavator of Maltese, Cycladic and Cretan prehistory. John was a most self-effacing man and would no doubt have been embarrassed to hear this tribute, but it is nonetheless true to say that without his excavations at Knossos, we would still know next to nothing of Neolithic and early Bronze Age Knossos, and certainly none of my research would have been possible. Thank you.